Okay, I'd like to invite our last speaker, David Smith from Mississippi State University.
All right, thank you. What I'm going to represent here today is really the work of my graduate student, Min Wang. She's part of a group of us at Mississippi State that have an interest in beef cattle health, and so we see that one component of that, as we've discussed all afternoon, is the economic component and understanding where our costs lie. So, of course, bovine respiratory disease, at least in the United States, and I believe in many other places around the world, is a very high-impact disease. It's costly because cattle die. It's also costly because some cattle get sick, and when they do get sick, they have costs related to treatment to try to keep them from getting sick. They have costs related to prevention. Those calves that get sick may have decreased performance, growth performance, and their carcasses may be of less value at marketing. So it's an expensive disease, and in the United States, there's estimates across the entire industry that bovine respiratory disease might cost $643 million. You can find a wide range of numbers, and most of those numbers are largely based on looking at sectors of the industry post-harvest or post-weaning. And so that's a sector of the industry where we understand that there's a number of stressors that are placed on cattle through weaning, commingling, transportation, that we understand how those might influence the risk for disease, but we're interested in that component on the farm before calves are weaned, and that is a unique situation, I believe, and important maybe for us to understand bovine respiratory disease, because that's a disease, that's a time period in a calf's life when they're out on green grass and beside their moms, and they're not suffering those stressors that we associate with the post-weaning phase. Anyways, we've got a lot of interest, our group, in that risk for pneumonia in calves prior to weaning, but today I'm just going to talk about what we've looked at in terms of the cost of that disease pre-weaning. So weaning, BRD in calves prior to weaning is actually the leading category of death for calves 3 weeks of age or older until weaning. So it's an important component. USDA estimates that about 3% of calves have incidence of BRD prior to weaning, but there's a very high standard deviation around that estimate. The U.S. Meat Animal Research Center, which has a lot of cattle in Clay Center, Nebraska, they looked at 20 years of data representing about over 30,000 calves, and their overall estimate was 10% of their calves get pneumonia prior to weaning, but that ranged from 3% to 24% per year. We have our own data of about just slightly less than 10,000 calves from 28 management groups and 7 ranches in Nebraska. So we've seen that the total overall cumulative incidence of BRD is about 9%, but that ranges from 5% to 45% within those herds that are experiencing problems. And our group has conducted some surveys of cow-calf producers. We asked producers in 3 eastern U.S. states and three western states in the plains about their experience with BRD, and 21% of producers say they've had problems with nursing calves getting respiratory disease. And when we asked veterinarians about the experience of their clients, they pretty much agreed. They said, well, they thought it was about 18% of their cow-calf producing clients had problems with respiratory disease. So this is an area that's been little studied, and there's been little critical evaluation of the cost of BRD in this component. And so that leads to the objective of this study, which was to estimate the direct economic cost of BRD in beef calves prior to weaning in the United States and we're considering components of mortality and morbidity, which included drug costs and decreased gain performance. So I have an important disclaimer here when we get to the numbers, that this assessment does not consider the labor costs for treatment or prevention, which we think might be large, doesn't include the costs for vaccines or other preventative measures, but these are costs that we're currently evaluating in research, so we hope to add that to the model later on. So we use data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, National Animal Health Monitoring System reports from different studies that they've done with beef cattle. The USDA Ag Statistics Service produces reports. We used Agricultural Marketing Services information on calf value. We used data from some peer-reviewed papers. In some cases, Min had to take the data from those papers and simulate them to simulate the data to get the details that she needed. And we had health records from those 9,900 calves from those Nebraska ranches that also gave us some of the distributions about variability and uncertainty to come up with our estimates. We created Min created a Monte Carlo model using at-risk software, which is an Excel add-on software package. She simulated our estimates of uncertainty and the cost of BRD and pre-weaning calves 10,000 times, and then I'll show you a sensitivity analysis about that. So of course you can't see that, and neither can I, but this is the framework of the entire model. So it shows you the various components. The boxes that are in purple represent the data sources and the distributions that we got from those data sources. The values in blue represent numbers of calves. So essentially, if I can maybe demonstrate that. So we start with the total U.S. beef cow herd, then how many of those had calves, how many of those calves got sick for other reasons or died for other reasons, how many of them had respiratory disease. Then we start to put some dollars to those values, including dollars for kilograms of production loss. An important component of that you need to consider when you're considering the reliability of our estimate is that we valued a calf that died as the value of that calf had it been weaned. All right, and so we were assuming an average 400-pound or 180-kilo calf at weaning. And the other way you might have looked at that is, well, that calf was 100 kilos when it was weaned. You should just take what a 100-kilo calf would be worth if it went to the market. But that's not the way the industry works. In fact, most of the fixed and variable costs have already been incurred before that calf was ever born. And so that farmer is hoping to recoup those costs by marketing a larger calf. It's not his intention to market that lighter calf. And so we believe that a more fair way to represent the loss of a calf is by what did that farmer lose when he lost the calf, and that was the ability to market a heavier calf at weaning. Okay, so in total then we end up with drug costs, the weight of performance that's lost, and the number of calves that died. So our total outputs for the cost to BRD include mortality. That was divided up into the deaths due to respiratory disease less than 3 weeks of age, for calves less than 3 weeks of age, and deaths due to BRD for calves that are 3 weeks or more. Morbidity, including the cost of the drugs to treat BRD, and the losses associated with reduced weaning weights. So here's the number. We estimate that in the United States, over in the years between 2010 and 2014, the average loss was $144 million, and the 90% credible interval is between $121 million and $170 million, to give you an idea of our uncertainty about that estimate. I want to point out that the mortality component of that $144 million is $118 million, so it is by far the largest component compared to the $27 million attributed to morbidity. To put those numbers into a scale that makes more sense, I think intuitively, on a cost for every cow in the United States, that's about $4.8 per cow. And if you think that about 1 in 5 of those cow herds have problems with bovine respiratory disease, and they're the ones that are bearing these costs, you could multiply that number by 5, so that's about $25 per cow in those herds that are experiencing losses of calves with BRD prior to weaning. Well, the sensitivity analysis shows that the real critical values, the values that really influence our estimates, relate to the number of calves that died. So hopefully those numbers are right. If they are right, they also point to the areas where we might have some impact on influencing those costs. So let me point out, the important thing isn't the big number, it's where are those losses occurring. And 82%, according to our model, 82% of the cost of BRD in calves prior to weaning is due to mortality, calves that die. And that's especially true in calves 3 weeks of age or older, because they make up more than half of the total costs. So there is some cost related to loss in weaning weight, but that was just a little bit more than 10% of the total costs, and the cost of drugs to treat BRD only made up about 8%. So calves get sick and they lose weight, but they compensate, and by weaning they've made a lot of that back up. And the big deal is when a calf dies and doesn't have a chance to go on to be weaned. All right, so between 2010 and 2014, BRD in pre-weaned calves most likely cost the U.S. cattle industry an average of $144 million per year. Remember, that doesn't consider labor or prevention costs, and the largest component was calf mortality. So therefore, we believe that strategies that will help to decrease BRD deaths might be the best thing to minimize the cost of BRD in pre-weaned beef calves. And we think that those components would include, quickly identifying and reliably identifying sick calves so that they get treated early, that the therapy is effective, and that preventive strategies are employed to reduce the likelihood that calves get sick or die in the first place. All right, with that, let me thank you all for being here so late in the day, and I'll acknowledge the members of our team at Mississippi State University and the funding sources that have made this research possible. And if there's time, we'll take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, could you wait for a microphone? That's all the interpreters need it, so they can translate for anybody.
Can you speculate on how much BVD persistent infection maybe is influencing some of this respiratory health issues?
So that's a really good question. My answer is no. That wasn't part of this. Of course, we think that a number of viral components are really important, particularly in the cow-calf herd, but how much of that is due to any particular virus, I couldn't even speculate on.
Okay, I think we'll wrap this session up just now. You can maybe speak to David afterwards, just because the closing ceremony starts in just a few minutes. Thank you very much for all attending today. I think you can all agree we've had a spectacular session and some very good speakers, so if you can show your appreciation again, thank you.